Phantom by Joe Nesbo is available now. Murder and violence also feature in a controversial new production at the National Theatre, but this time the deaths aren't fictional. Can We Talk About This is an attack on Islamic extremism and the multiculturalist policies which the creator believes allow violence to flourish, and is told in part through the medium of dance. Celebrating its 25th anniversary this year, DV8 shows no sign of taming its uncompromising approach. Founded by Lloyd Newson in direct response to the conformity of classical ballet and other traditional dance forms, the company's works have explored subjects ranging from disability and sexuality to serial killers, evolving on stage and screen through landmark works like Strange Fish and Enter Achilles. Can We Talk About This begins with the question, do you feel morally superior to the Taliban? It argues that fear of racism has led to a failure to criticize certain aspects of Islam, a form of cultural relativism.
My brother just said, when we find you, you're going to end up in several bin runs.
Democracy and freedom is no good for the British, no good for Afghanistan, and in fact, we need an alternative.
He said it was obligatory to execute him because he was an apostate. An apostate must be executed.
The production is structured around flashpoints in recent history, beginning in the mid-80s, including the case of a Bradford headmaster sacked for questioning multiculturalism, the scandal over Danish cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, the fatwa on Salman Rushdie, and other writers who face death threats.
The individual who wants to kill me because I'm an apostate of Islam is inspired to do that from the scripture of Islam.
The theme of Can We Talk About This could scarcely be more relevant. But does the production resolve the many questions it poses about religion and freedom of expression? Or is this latest work from DV8 holding a one-way conversation?
The trouble with us in the West is that we succumb to a pious paralysis, where we can't even say that we're superior to the Taliban. Why can't we?
So Sarah, this gives us a rather different political perspective than I suppose we're used to seeing at the National. It's, you know, an attack on multiculturalism, it's critique of some aspects of Islam.
It's deliberately, I think, provocative and polemical, and I think it's hugely bold and brave and quite important. And I think really the clues in the title, it is Can We Talk About This? And I think the moments at which it is absolutely unbelievably sort of essential and brilliant are the bits where it raises the questions, odd for a dance work, of what you can talk about in a society that believes in free speech. And I think it raises really, really important issues that haven't been raised anywhere else, about what we can say about Islam, whether we self-censor, whether people are scared of saying things, and sets that in the context of what happens, but also in the context of dance, and that's how it tells its story.
Joe, did you find it as bold, as important?
No, I felt like it was soapbox theatre, just lecturing me over and over again, and I have to say I had an issue with this whole thing about using voices, because I think you need to be very careful. For example, when they use the voice of, you know, the late Ray Hunniford, as we've seen, they only tell part of the story. If you go back and you look at his article he wrote in the Salisbury Review, actually he really attacks West Indian families, West Indian culture, attacks the work of Linton Kwesi Johnson. So for me, they were self-censoring what the audience were going to hear, actually. So I was very troubled at using Ray Hunniford as this kind of real outlaw, heroic figure who attacked multiculturalism. There's a lot more going on there, and I did wonder if they did their research.
But I suppose what they were doing was mounting an argument, a piece of polemic.
It was a piece of polemic. It's interesting you've used that word, Sarah, you've used that word. And polemic is a very powerful word. I mean, you know, it comes from the Greek and it means to do with war. And that was my only worry about it. I think it's an immensely important piece of work, and I think, you know, drama was invented to put this kind of controversial work out on the stage. But it doesn't work if it means that this is something we've got to fight against rather than deal with. And I think because, as you say, it was, you know, in a way, it had to have its own agenda, and therefore it had to make its own points. But just as a bit of performance, I think there should have been a bit more tonality there, a bit more light and dark, and we should occasionally have heard reasons that led up to this.
Verbatim theatre, and I saw London Road recently, that does it so well. It's not a lecture. So I think they really needed to think about how were they going to try and get those voices across in a theatrical way and a dramatic way to the audience.
It was Frank Zappa, I think, who once said something like, you know, writing about music is like dancing about architecture. And what we've got here is dancing about architecture. You know, there's the polemic, there's the argument, there's all the stuff about multiculturalism, then there's the dancing. And what I was trying to work out was, is the dancing actually adding anything to the argument? And is the argument adding anything to the dance? And I saw some brilliant dance. I saw some brilliant physical movement. I saw people who were at the peak of their powers. I saw things I've never seen before. People floating across the stage. You know, as if on a conveyor belt. I saw someone walk up a wall. I saw a guy become a chair. I saw a woman become a chair. You know, there was no chair there, but she was somehow sitting down. And I just thought, that's phenomenal. And it was full of these coups de théâtre. But none of it was actually adding to the argument.
And I say one coup de théâtre that I particularly enjoyed was the seminal discussion on Newsnight with Jeremy Paxman and Anjem Chowdhury, with dancers in the foreground. But it would seem to be very clever.
I thought it was very clever because I think the purpose of the dance is that it isn't verbatim theatre. I think if it was verbatim theatre, that you would ask for more balance than you get. I think the purpose of the dance is to create a style and a way in which it sort of holds the piece. And the bit where they're moving like skittles around Jeremy and the different arguments I thought was wonderful. I thought there were the bits where, you know, people fall to the stage or battle. It gives you an image of what's happening. But it also does stop it being something else. And I think it's quite important that I don't think Lloyd Newson is aiming to be like the Tricycle productions of things which have been, you know, discussions of what has happened. He's doing something quite different. And I think there are bits of it that you can feel uncomfortable with.
He's using those voices.
Selectively.
Absolutely.
Yes,
and if you go to the programme, and he talks about, or the programme, it talks about using prominent voices. This was another issue for me. If you really want to know about an issue like multiculturalism, you have to think about grassroots voices, because that's where it's happening. So there weren't grassroots voices, and actually to me the production was much more about not looking at multiculturalism, but looking at someone's notion of Islam. And to me it would have been a much more challenging production if they'd done a production about the great things about Islam. That would have been much more challenging for me.
Or, and maybe this is me speaking as a journalist, if it had been not necessarily more balanced, but just when you're switching your viewpoint from one side to the other, so you don't have the sense that you're being lectured at, would it have made it a more sophisticated piece of drama if your loyalties were having to shift from one side to the other?
I think absolutely it would, and as you say, Dredden, I mean, nothing comes out of nowhere. So we're looking at this kind of 30-year period of history when multiculturalism has been very effective, and people have criticised it too in this country. But actually we just needed a bit of the backstory, I think, even if that could make us agree even more with what he was trying to say. But I think you're absolutely right. You did get a sense of being lectured at rather than being encouraged into a dialogue.
And I also wonder whether, I mean, I'm familiar with a lot of these arguments about multiculturalism, so something that the theatre regards as cutting edge and controversial has actually been in the op-ed articles of newspapers and magazines for several years. If they'd done it, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, perhaps that would have had an element of shock.
I think that's true.
Yeah,
and I think there are weaker and stronger passages in it. I mean, oddly, the Ray Hunniford stuff I had most problem with. But I think that the point he's making is that, if you like, the debate's being conducted on the other side, and so this is his moment. And why I think it's strongest when it's about freedom of speech, when it's really at its absolute best, it seems to me, is when it challenges you on the notions that actually, if you want to believe in a society with freedom of speech, then you have to defend it as well. And it is critical of the banning orders and so on, because what it's really an argument for is the right to talk about something. And I think that's why it's important.
Well, thank you for all your freedom of expression there. DV8's Theatre, Can We Talk About This, is at the Littleton Theatre until the 28th of March, before moving to the Lowry in Salford and the Brighton Dome in May.